A very good evening to all. I, on behalf of Institute of Pulmocare and Research, cordially invite you to the 7th session of Pulmocon 2021. The discussion for today is about HRCT and MRI scan for physicians. To chair the session, I would like to invite Dr. Pinak Pani Bhattacharya. He is a consultant radiologist at Quadra Medical Services and a renowned national faculty in radiology. He has several publications in international and national platforms to his credit. Sir, I welcome you and I request you to kindly proceed over the session. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Without wasting much time, we'll go directly to the session. It's my proud privilege to introduce Dr. Priyanka Naranj, a very young enterprising radiologist who is an additional professor in the Department of Radiodiagnosis and Interventional Radiology at All India Institute of Medical Science, New Delhi. Her areas of interest are thoracic, pediatric, and intervention in radiology. She has more than 50 index journal publication and 32 chapters she has written. She has presented invited talks, about 55 of them, and she is a member of Society of Chest Imaging and Interventions, IRIA, ISPR, ISVIR, and SAR. Dr. Priyanka will be talking on the topic of role of HRCT for the physicians. I welcome her and request her to start her deliberation. Over to you, Priyanka.
Thank you, sir, for your kind introduction. I would like to thank Dr. Bhattacharya, sir, for giving me this opportunity to speak on CT of the airway diseases. Is my screen visible? Is my screen visible, Saini?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So I'll begin with the CT of the airway diseases. So the airway, anatomically, it is a continuous structure, but for descriptive purposes, we can divide them into upper airway and the lower airway. By upper airway, we mean anatomically or imaging wise, whatever area of the airway, that is the larynx and the upper trachea that lies above the level of the thoracic inlet, and the lower airway that is below the level of the thoracic inlet. And the lower airway, further, we tend to divide arbitrarily into a central, peripheral, and the small airways, each of which I will be describing in detail in the subsequent slides. Now, also, we can talk about the airways as a part of the large airways or the small airways. By large airways, we mean that the airways which are visible on our imaging and are more usually those which are more than 2 millimeters in diameter. The central airway is constituted by the trachea and the main bronchi, whereas the peripheral airway, by peripheral airway, it means the lobar, segmental, and the proximal subbronchi. The small airways refer to the distal airways, which are small in size, usually less than 2 millimeters in diameter. They lack the cartilage and the submucosal glands, and these are not normally visible on a routine MDCT. Now, the airway has a division, sort of a bichotomous division in the lungs. So there are almost 23 generations of these airway, which forms the two important zones, which are the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. The trachea, from trachea till the level of the terminal bronchioles, is predominantly the conducting zones, and within these levels, up to the regions of the segmental and the subsegmental bronchi, they contain a cartilaginous wall. Whereas the bronchioles, the terminal bronchioles, and the respiratory zone bronchioles, those are the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, these are non-cartilaginous and airways, and predominantly the air exchange happens from the levels of the respiratory bronchioles and onwards. So there are diseases which will be affecting particularly these conducting zones versus the zones of which will affect the oxygen exchange. And there will be several different manifestations on the CT. Now, imaging is definitely helpful in detection of the site of abnormality, where exactly within the airways the abnormality is localized. Now, further characterization of this abnormality can be done on imaging, whether the obstruction in the airway is extrinsic or intrinsic. Within the intrinsic causes, there will be causes which are affecting the wall of this airways or the tracheobronchial tree, or the obstruction is intraluminal. Imaging helps in determining the exact length of the abnormal segment, whether the involvement is diffuse, whether the involvement is focal, is it fixed obstruction or a dynamic obstruction, how much, that is the degree of narrowing is it is causing. And based on certain imaging features, we may be able to give a specific diagnosis as well. Challenging airway imaging is, first of all, multiphasic imaging sometimes may be required, and we have to try to do it with the least possible radiation exposure. Also, we perform usually a CT in a single phase inspiratory scan, and which may underestimate or miss certain abnormalities. And at that time point, we may require some form of a dynamic imaging. Amongst the imaging modalities, the imaging of the chest or and the airways begins with a chest X-ray in a frontal or a lateral view, and ultrasound is helpful in the evaluation of certain abnormalities of the upper airways, and MRI in the dynamic imaging of the airways, also in the sleep apnea cases. But remember that the CT is the workhorse of the airway imaging. So in the current generation of the scanners, we perform volumetric CT in a single breath hold, and it gives a very precise delineation of the entire tracheobronchial tree, including the distal airways. And although we do not usually give contrast, is not required just for the visualization of the central airways, but in certain conditions, such as if we are suspecting any central mass, or we are suspecting that there is atelectatic lung, and we are suspecting the obstruction is caused by some tumor or infections like tuberculosis, IV contrast is usually given as a part of this from CT. Usually we see these CT images in the axial planes. That is foremost as a beginning for any evaluation of this chest scan. But especially in evaluating the airway abnormalities, airway pathologies, the MPRs is very helpful. The MPRs means that is a multiplanar reconstructions. We can reconstruct this acquired volumetric CT data into various planes such as coronal, sagittal planes. In both mediastinal lung windows, we can see and determine how much is the length of stenosis and further extent of involvement. Also, virtual bronchoscopy, especially does not have any distinct utility, but wherein other bronchoscopic techniques are not available, and we want to see distal to the site of obstruction, CT is helpful. And in virtual bronchoscopy, you may get almost a bronchoscopy type images, which I'll show further. MINIP and volume rendered images are also useful in overall depiction of this airway anatomy. So these are the coronal images, coronal multiplanar reconstructed images, and the coronal MINIP images, that is a minimum intensity projection images. Now in minimum intensity projection images means it combines all the attenuation values which are lower attenuation values, and it just like MIP. In the MIP images is a maximum intensity projection images. We'll be able to better see the nodules, but in the MINIP images, it is useful for the delineation of those structures which are containing the air that has the lower attenuation values. So this is a kind of a MINIP image. We call it a minimum intensity projection image, which is very helpful in delineating the entire central and the proximal bronchial tree, as in this image. These are the virtual bronchoscopy images, which gives this endoluminal view of trachea carina. And we can see this is a normal trachea and the carina in the virtual bronchoscopy images. These images are reconstructed from a single CT, which is acquired in the full inspiratory phase. Some more examples of this multiplanar reconstructions, which I was trying to say that the airway imaging, for airway imaging, these reconstructions are absolutely important to view. So in this coronal image, we can see there is a focal stenosis in the bronchus intermedius on right side. This is another case in the mediastinal window, coronal, almost a coronal oblique view, where we can see that the left main bronchus is obliterated by the mucus contents, leading to the entire collapse of the left lung. These are the volume rendered images where you can see the left bronchus is cut off. These are MINIP images, again useful for quick delineation of any anatomical variation in the tracheobronchial tree. Like in this case, there was a presence of this tracheal bronchus. And another patient in whom there is a obstruction of the left main bronchus with the distal hyperinflated left lung, which are well appreciated on this coronal multiplanar MINIP images. Also, apart from a full if clinically there's a suspicion of a small airway disease or tracheobronchomalacia, we want to acquire a scan which gives a picture of these tracheobronchial tree and the airways in inspiration and expiration. So like this, we have to perform a paired end inspiratory and end expiratory CT. So in this image, fully inspirated in inspiration, the trachea is appearing this like this oval with the lungs showing subtle mosaic attenuation. That is, we have some areas which are looking normal density and some subtle areas which are more lucent in the periphery. So in fact, performing a expiratory scan has confirmed this finding that there is some areas which are more lucent even on expiration. So this is suggestive of air trapping, and in the proximal bronchi also, this is the expiratory phase identified by this, seeing this collapse of the posterior wall of the trachea. Let's come to the several disorders. So what are these lower airway pathologies? We have tried to divide them into the pathologies affecting the central airways, peripheral airways, and the small airways. In the central airways, the pathology could be compression due to some extrinsic causes, or there are intrinsic causes affecting the mural airways, the wall of these central airways, or causing intraluminal obstructions. So these extrinsic causes could be, again, congenital lesions, such as because of some vascular compression, anomalous vessel compressing on this tracheobronchial tree, or certain cis bronchopulmonary foregut malformations, chest deformities. Inflammatory causes such as lymph nodes, abscesses may cause extrinsic compression of these central airways, or masses such as tumors secondary to the lymphoma, germ cell tumors, or vascular malformations. In this image, we can see there is compression of the trachea more on the right side by an enlarged thyroid gland. And in the another case, we can see these are the three great vessels. There is compression of the anterior wall of the trachea by the brachiocephalic artery. So it is a innominate artery syndrome, which is causing the compression of the upper trachea. The chronic compression due to the enlarged pulmonary arteries can lead to this especially the right bronchus and the bronchus intermedius compression between the enlarged right pulmonary artery and the vertebra. So, and because of this chronic compression, it may lead to the bronchomalacia. So in this, again, in paired scans of inspiratory and expiratory phase, we can see that there is narrowing in the inspiratory phase itself, with the further collapse of the right bronchus intermedius on the expiratory phases due to the enlarged pulmonary artery. So vascular compressions are common causes of the central airway extrinsic compressions. This is another case. It is showing multiple conglomerated nodes in the subcardial location, which we can see there is some in fact, not just extrinsic compression, but the node has possibly eroded into the wall of the left main bronchus and causing this narrowing of the left main bronchus. So on the MINIP image, again, we can see over here that we are able to delineate the site of this nodes into the left main bronchus. This was a case of tuberculosis. Coming on to the examples of cases which affect the wall of the central airway. Now, because of some congenital deficiencies of the cartilage or presence of the complete cartilaginous rings, there may be congenital tracheobronchomalicias or tracheal stenosis or bronchial atrasias, tracheoesophageal fistulas, branching abnormalities. These all arise from the abnormalities affecting the wall of these central airways. Certain inflammatory diseases such as tuberculosis itself, vasculitis, especially the GPA, relapsing polychondritis, sarcoidosis, these are common causes of stenosis in the central airways as caused secondary to inflammation. And then there are certain miscellaneous disorders. This is an example of, these are the axial and coronal and MINIP images. These are of one patient, this is of separate patient. Now here we can see there is a outpouching, there is a air-filled outpouching from the right lateral wall of the trachea. And on coronal image, we can see that it has a linear configuration and it is coursing towards the right upper lobe. So this was a case of a tracheal bronchus, that is the normal variation. But sometimes it may present with recurrent infections happening only in this right upper zone. Then we have to go back and look at this tracheobronchial tree on CT to look whether we are dealing with such type of a narrowed tracheal bronchus. Another case, there is this right tracheal bronchus, which is having a very high origin and directly supplying the right upper lobe. That was the commonest variant. Another common variant is the cardiac bronchus. Now in this image, we can see that on the coronal image, coronal MPR image, we can see that there is another outpouching, which is a blind ending stump, which is arising from the medial wall of the bronchus intermedius. This is an example of a cardiac bronchus. Now, complete cartilage ring of the trachea is also one of the entity presenting with stridor in a very early neonatal or early infantile phases. Now, this is a normal trachea image where we can see that it has an oval or an oblong shape, and the posterior wall will be slightly flattened appearance on scans. However, in this child, this child had this complete round appearance of the trachea in the mid-thoracic level, mid-thoracic trachea. Now this type of a rounded appearance we get on CT in cases of the complete cartilage ring of the trachea. So we know that the posterior wall of the trachea has no cartilage, and that's why it has this sort of a flattened appearance normally. And when in a child, especially, we see this complete roundening of this tracheal lumen, we have to suspect the presence of a complete cartilaginous ring. It is usually associated with other disorders as well, especially with the pulmonary sling abnormalities. And congenital tracheobronchomalacia again gives a picture something like this, which we can see this is a crescent shape of the trachea on imaging, on axial images. So this was a case of a tracheobronchomalacia. This was another adult patient. You can see there is almost more than 70% collapse of the posterior wall of this trachea into the lumen. So these are the examples of tracheobronchomalacia, which happens due to the abnormal softening due to the abnormality of the cartilaginous rings. Again, tracheobronchomalacia, all the time on CT, we may not, in a single phase, especially if a single phase CT is performed, we may not be able to see this because the collapse is intermittent and usually happens during the expiratory phase. And there are scans which we can take on CT, such as Cine CT images, dedicatedly only in the region of like carina and lower trachea and the proximal bronchi regions and perform the cine CT to look dynamically the amount of collapse as well. Again, on CT, certain wall abnormalities congenital abnormalities that we can identify are presence of the congenital subglottic webs and congenital subglottic stenosis. So these are the sagittal and the coronal MINIP images which delineate the site level of stenosis exactly. And the virtual bronchoscope image, we can see that there is this stenosis secondary to the web formation happening at the level of the just below the in the subglottic trachea. Post-intubation stenosis also common sites are this present in this subglottic and slightly lower trachea at the level of the thoracic inlets. We commonly see a smooth tapering type of narrowing at these levels in cases of the post-intubation stenosis. It may be irregular and extent is well delineated on these coronal images. Now, certain other inflammatory causes also affect the proximal major trachea and the bronchi. In this case, we can see that in the left upper lobe, we have a thick walled cavity with multiple tree and bud nodules. And on mediastinal window in axial and coronal images, we can see that there is a smooth thickening of the walls of this left main bronchus. You can compare it with the right side. Here on the right side, it is relatively normal. We do not see any abnormal wall thickening. It is opposed by this right pulmonary artery. On the left side, we can see that definitely there is a thickening of the walls of the entire left main bronchus. On this coronal MINIP image, we can see that there is a narrowing. There is definitely luminal narrowing of the left main bronchus and its wall is thickened. And we have evidence of other evidence such as lymph nodes at the left hyla. We have multiple nodules. So this was a case of tuberculosis with the tubercular tracheobronchitis as well. TB also can give rise to the wall thickening, which may have this, apart from smooth, it may also give rise to something like this nodular pattern. So certain diseases, that is this infective diseases, infective causes, malignant causes like adenocarcinomas, they involve the proximal airways entirely. That is, there is no sparing of the posterior membrane of the trachea. So here we can see this was a case of tuberculosis, which gave rise to this kind of a nodular thickening of this entire trachea. And this was a case of an adenocarcinoma, where we can see that there is a huge gross thickening of the entire circumferential of the trachea extending till the level of the right main bronchus as well. So this was sampled and it turned out to be adenocarcinoma in this case. This was a child of ALL who febrile neutropenia and presented with fever and stridor. So chest CT, routine chest CT was performed and we found this evidence of fungal pneumonia in the lungs, which is evidenced by presence of consolidation with the huge surrounding ground glass opacities. But the stridor was not explained, and we have to evaluate the proximal tree, tracheobronchial tree carefully. Now, on visualizing this proximal tree, we found that there was this nodular multifocal thickenings, which we can see at the level of the carina. A part of thickening was also identified in the region of the upper trachea. So this was a case of fungal infection, invasive pulmonary aspergillosis with involvement of the this type of focal involvement, multifocal involvement of the tracheobronchial tree. Again, another case in which we can see there is a subglottic stenosis in an adult patient. This is a very common site for GPA involvement also. Subglottic thickening in the subglottic stenosis. Other features also include similar to process of a nodular pattern, which may have a gross thickening of the entire tracheobronchial tree. Other etiologies such as amyloidosis also affects this proximal airway, and in that also the posterior membrane is involved. And in amyloidosis, we may see presence of some calcifications or ossifications in the wall thickening of this tracheobronchial tree. This is another case where we can see there is a thickening of the trachea carina wall. It is extending into the bilateral, both the bronchi, right and the left side. Now, apart from the thickening itself, we are able to see this presence of calcifications in the cartilage thickening. These are the coronal images where you can see the entire wall thickening of this tracheobronchial tree in a young patient. These are MIP images where we can see this calcification, airway wall calcification, we can see. So there are several differentials for the airway wall calcifications. So once we start seeing this, we have to think of a process which is related to cartilage. So cartilage related processes is chondrocalcinosis. They can cause airway wall calcifications. And whenever this cartilaginous processes are there, it is going to spare the posterior membrane. It may be age-related calcifications, maybe certain drugs such as warfarin is known to cause such airway wall calcifications. Condition called as a TPOP, that is a tracheobronchopathia osteochondroplastica, can cause relapsing polychondritis is a differential, and also amyloidosis and chronic granulomatous infections. So this is one spot image where we can see there is a nodular type of calcification involving the trachea with sparing of the posterior membrane. So this was a case of TPOP. It is a rare idiopathic disease which is characterized by the osseous or cartilaginous nodules in the submucosa of the trachea and the bronchi, and it characteristically spares the posterior membranous portions of the trachea. This is another case where you can see that there is a small nodules in the trachea, and in the lungs you are seeing this type of a multiple cavities. So this was a case of, you have to suspect in such situations respiratory papillomatosis, which is caused by the human papillomavirus, which has again characterized by the presence of multiple upper airway papillomas and pulmonary nodules which may cavitate like this. This is a pre-malignant condition, and its early recognition and curatages are important. Some disorders are there which may cause increase in the diameter of the proximal tracheobronchial tree, that is the trachea and the major bronchi. As in this image, you can see they are hugely dilated and giving a pattern of a saber sheet type of an appearance. So this is a condition called as a Muir-Kuhn syndrome or the congenital tracheobronchomegaly. Other etiologies which may affect this proximal central bronchi are the bronchial diverticulae. You can see that there are multiple small diverticulae which are arising from this bilateral mainstem bronchi. Especially we see them in the cases of COPD. Let us see some of the intraluminal obstruction causes in the central airways. Again, it could be presentation, depending upon the presentation, we have to also see if it's an acute presentation. The intraluminal obstructions are usually caused by foreign body, blood clots, mucus plugs, and more of the chronic type of an obstructive causes includes tumors or presence of some chronic infection, granulation tissues. X-ray wise, we know that the foreign body or radiolucent, when it's radio opaque foreign body, it's easily identified, especially where exactly in the tracheobronchial tree it is localized, and complications secondary to this foreign body may be identified on the X-ray. Problem occurs when we are dealing with a radiolucent type of a foreign body, which are not easily appreciable on the chest radiograph, and that's when the CT is definitely helpful. This was an example. This was a case of a 65-year-old woman who had a 1-week history of cough and breathlessness. And on CT, we could identify a well-defined structure, rounded structure, which was partially occluding the right bronchus intermedius. On virtual bronchoscopy, we are able to identify that foreign body, and she spontaneously cupped it out, and it was a chickpea which was obliterating this right bronchus intermedius. This is another case, is an elderly male who presented with hemopsis, and this was a case of a CA lung. He had a hemopsis, but in the central areas we can see that there is this rounded, again, irregular structure, which was partially obliterating the right main bronchus, and it had this mottle type of lucencies within. And again, we can see the evidence of hemopsis in the form of multifocal ground glass opacity, some in the dependent regions as well. So this was just a blood clot, which gives rise to this type of a picture. It resembles a mucus plug. So these blood clots, mucus plugs on CT, they show us a soft tissue attenuation lesion, which may obliterate the bronchi and with presence of a central lucent areas. Coming on to tumors of the tracheobronchial tree, most commonly we can say which may present as the endobronchial or endoluminal tumors are the carcinoid tumors. Here on a CT, we can see on an axial image, there is a rounded structure which is obliterating the lumen of the left main bronchus, but it is leading to the hyperinflation of the left lung rather than any collapse. And on contrast CT, we can see that it has an intense enhancement round ovoid lesion, which is involving the left main bronchus, the case of a carcinoid tumor. Now, this image is just showing that in the carcinoid tumors, which are endobronchial, and the extent of involvement can be given when the distal to the obstruction there is some secondary changes such as collapse. Like in this case, we have a mass obliterating the right bronchus intermedius, but we are able to see that the middle lobe bronchus has taken off and it is not involved. But the lower lobe bronchus, distal to the mass, there is entire collapse. And on a coronal MINIP image, we can delineate the craniocaudal extent of the airway involvement best. Other common tumor of the airway is one of these, which I'm showing on this case. Here we can see there is some soft tissue which is obliterating the right, just at the level of, above the level of the carina and the lower trachea. It is involving the wall of the trachea, especially the posterolateral wall, with the extension extraluminally as well. However, in the lower part of this right main bronchus and the bronchus intermedius, there are contents which have these mottle lucencies. So this is not the part of the tumor. It is the mucus plugs which is causing this collapse of this right lower lobe. But on the coronal image, we can see the exact extent of this heterogeneous mass, which has both intraluminal as well as the extraluminal extension along the wall of this trachea. On virtual bronchoscopy image, you can visualize this mass. This was a case of adenoid cystic carcinoma. Coming on to some pathologies of the peripheral airways, the most commonly the peripheral airway abnormalities are secondary to the dilatation of these airways rather than stenosis, which presents clinically. So the dilatation of the peripheral airways, which is beyond the segmental, the lobar, segmental, and subsegmental bronchi, is a common etiology is your bronchiectasis. CT signs of bronchiectasis are the bronchial wall dilatation, first of all. What regions we call, what bronchi we call as dilated bronchi are those bronchi which are larger than the accompanying artery, wherein the criteria used in adults is like bronchoatrial ratio of more than 1. In children, usually we take it as 0.8. Presence of signet ring appearance, and this the signs are also there of bronchiectasis. Now, by the bronchoarterial ratio, I mean that normally on CT, the normal bronchi to adjacent pulmonary arterial diameter ratio is 1:1, and when it is more than 1, it gives rise to this picture, which is called as a signet ring appearance, and this is one of the feature which is used for a detection of the bronchiectasis. Other criteria are lack of bronchial tapering. So normally the bronchi will taper as we trace them into the lungs beyond the hilum. If they are non-tapering, they are looking this type of a parallel lines. This is the feature of a bronchiectasis. And also normally we are not able to see peripheral airways within 1 centimeter of the costal pleura. If you start seeing a dilated lumen of the bronchioles, this is also one of the important signs to detect early bronchiectasis. Based on the distribution of the bronchiectasis, whether it is localized or diffuse forms, several etiologies can be narrowed down. Like in this image, we can see there is a cylindrical bronchiectasis which is localized to the right lower lobe and middle lobe. And on coronal image, we saw that there is a obstructive lesion. It was a foreign body in a child, chronic foreign body in the bronchus intermedius. The strictures, obstruction by the tumors, chronically tuberculosis, stenosis secondary to tuberculosis, also can lead to a localized form of a bronchiectasis, or because of the cicatrization secondary to TB, that may be localized upper lobe bronchiectasis may be seen in TB and sarcoidosis. These are the several diffuse causes of the diffuse bronchiectasis, which may have upper lobe predominance, such as ABPA, cystic fibrosis. Lower lobe predominance are seen in repeated childhood infections, primary ciliary dyskineas, which also have RML and middle lobar type of predominance, and NTM infections. And central bronchiectasis we see in ABPA. This is the example of the presence of a central bronchiectasis with multiple mucus plugs. This was a case of ABPA. In primary ciliary dyskinesias, we can see this is a case of a situs. In this case, we have presence of this multiple bronchiectasis more predominantly seen in the middle lobes and the lower lobes in the case of primary ciliary dyskinesias. Coming on to the last segment of the airways, that are the small airway diseases. Now, the CT signs are direct or indirect signs are there, which are described as signs for small airway disease. The direct signs includes the presence of centrilobular nodules on tree and bud pattern, ground glass nodules, which are distributed in the peribronchiolar and centrilobular distribution, and presence of small areas of the bronchiolectasis. Indirect signs are presence of air trapping, which will be demonstrated again in based on the expiratory scans, and presence of atelectasis and collapse. They are less commonly seen. So small airway diseases can be divided into a cellular bronchiolitis or constrictive bronchiolitis. In cellular bronchiolitis, usually on imaging, we get these centrilobular nodules, ground glass nodules with presence of bronchial wall thickenings. They are usually secondary to infections, respiratory bronchiolitis, or connective tissue disorders, also in cases of hypersensitivity pneumonitis. Whereas constrictive bronchiolitis component happens secondary to the narrowing due to chronic phases, such as collagen deposited fibrosis, which has already happened in the bronchiolar walls. It is seen in children in post-infectious bronchiolitis obliterans cases, sometimes in autoimmune and CTD associated ILDs, especially with rheumatoid arthritis. Post-transplant bronchiolitis gives rise to a picture of a constrictive bronchiolitis. So these are the examples of a cellular bronchiolitis, where you can see there's been some bronchial wall thickening, mild bronchiectasis is seen. There are fine centrilobular nodules, which are in tree and bud pattern in multifocal sites. And we can see there are more lucent areas where we are able to see these types of bronchiolar impactions, rather than those regions where there are no nodules. So this is a picture of a cellular bronchiolitis. Etiologies we have already seen. This is an image for obliterative bronchiolitis. Again, we can see on this MINIP image, we are able to see multifocal areas of lucent seeds overlapping the regions of normal attenuating lungs. So this was a child who came post RSV infection. We can see clearly that there are some segments which are more lucent, some segments which are more dense, sharply demarcated regions of air lucencies in both the lungs. This was a case of post-infectious bronchiolitis obliterans. So concluding, the airway lesions, the tracheobronchial lesions, there are a wide variety of abnormalities, and yes, CT is your modality of choice. Can perform most of the times as a routine. Also a contrast CT is performed, but especially if we are seeing just for the airway abnormalities, contrast may not be given. Axial images are always useful, and MPR 3D reconstructions, they do help us in evaluating the tracheobronchial disorders, and virtual bronchoscopy has an adjunctive role in localizing the lesion and also seeing beyond the level of the obstructions. So thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you, Dr. Priyanka, for your excellent, lucid, and very simple deliberation. We will keep the question and answer session at the end of it.
Sure, sir.
So may I, is Dr. Amrita here? Hello, is Dr. Amrita here?
Yes, she has sent her recorded speech, so you can request her.
Okay, so the next speech will be by Dr. Amrita Chakraborty. It will be on HRCT of COVID and post-COVID states. Amrita is again a fellow of Oncoradiology and Intervention Radiology at Tata Medical Center. Presently, she is associated as consultant radiologist in HCG Eco Center, Newtown, Kolkata. So may I now request to start the deliberation of Dr. Amrita, please. Thank you.
A very good evening to everybody. I am Dr. Amrita Chakraborty and I am consultant oncoradiologist at the HCG Eco Cancer Center, Newtown, Kolkata. Our topic of discussion today is post-COVID, the radiological perspective and what we actually need to know. So over the past 2 years, all of us have been facing this complication of COVID. We have been living in the COVID era, and as pulmonologists, most of the pulmonologists have been very actively involved in the treatment and management of COVID. COVID is now coming down, but a lot of patients are continuing to have post-COVID complications. That is what we will discuss today and the radiological perspective of that. So a subset of people recovering from COVID will have persistent chest imaging abnormalities, and the most common abnormalities that are being visualized post a COVID scan are ground glass opacities and reticular abnormality. These are the two main patterns, as we all know, which are being visualized on CT scans. So coming to the fact that approximately 50% of those patients who are being hospitalized and are having COVID, are being hospitalized post-COVID, are having chest complications and CT changes on an HRCT. The more the severity of the acute infection, the more the CT features. So these features which we are visualizing on a post-COVID patient CT scan can predominantly be divided into the following groups: the ground glass opacities, the parenchymal or subpleural bands, reticular abnormalities, evidence of fibrotic abnormalities, and air trapping. I will be discussing briefly regarding all this. Coming to, so this is basically what a CT thorax would look like in a patient post-COVID. So this patient, this is the base of the lung, because the base of the lung, as we all know, is the most common part of the lung that is showing features. So this patient in the base of the lung on a lung window is showing patchy areas of ground glass attenuation, which have retracted margin. So there is some amount of retraction which has set in because the disease is now in the resolving phase. And there are areas of reticular thickening, mosaic attenuation. So this is primarily what a resolving COVID would look like. And we state that this is a post-COVID resolving phase change. Now coming to the term fibrosis. So we see a lot of HRCT reports nowadays, which are terming post-COVID patients with changes as fibrosis. Now, what I would like to stress here is most of these COVID changes, post-COVID changes, would resolve in subsequent scans. So this is a 2-month scan, and if the same patient is followed up on an 8th-month scan, we would see that most of these changes have resolved. So my point of view here is that not all COVID changes should be termed as fibrosis. The use of the term fibrosis should be a very objective term, which should be limited to definitive findings like tractional bronchiectasis, bronchiolectasis, honeycombing, or architectural distortion. So only if these features are visualized on a post-COVID scan should we term that this patient is now going into post-COVID fibrosis. So here I would also like to stress that while we are seeing these changes, it is very important that the acute phase imaging of these patients be compared with the post-COVID scans so that the temporal course of the abnormality is well visualized and we can put up a better comment. So as we all know, COVID has been really, really bad. So ICU mortalities in this pandemic throughout the world have been about 30 to 50%. And in patients with underlying comorbidities like diabetes mellitus or other diseases, which I will come to later, the rate of hospitalization is 6 times higher. And to be very precise, the death rate has been approximately 12 times higher in those with comorbidities. So what are basically the risk factors which has aggravated COVID, and who are the patients who have presented with bad COVID with high ICU mortality and morbidity? These are usually patients of male sex with a higher body mass index, underlying history of coronary artery disease, cancer, hypercholesteremia, diabetes, chronic obstructive pulmonary airway disease, which was there in the background, or during hospital admission, those patients who have had liver dysfunctions or kidney dysfunctions, or a background history of interstitial lung disease. So these are the patients who have basically presented with bad COVID and who have also presented with COVID-related complications after the episode of infection. Now, coming to the role of imaging. So what is the role of imaging as far as COVID and post-COVID complications are concerned? So diagnosis and management, we all know the diagnosis, there was a big classification of CORADs regarding what is COVID and what is not, which everybody has been following over the past 1 to 2 years. I'm not going through that. Also, the COVID severity, the CORAD severity has been a very important part of the management of the patient regarding how severe the disease is. It has rather objectified the management of COVID, the COVID severity index. So diagnosis and management, radiology has played a very role. Identification of alternative diagnosis, that is not all patients presenting with SOB or all patients with fever and cough have had COVID. There are other differential diagnoses like flare-up of pulmonary tuberculosis. So differentiating that from COVID, also imaging has played a major role. And now in the setting of the post-COVID era, or patients who have resolved post-COVID, presence of complications in pulmonary embolism, this has also, imaging has played a major role in that also. So those patients who have had history of consistent chest symptoms like tachypnea, respiratory distress, a feeling of tightness in the chest, post-COVID have been termed as long COVID, or rather another term called post-acute sequelae of COVID, or PASC, has been used for these patients. So this PASC also has a few risk factors, aggravating factors like increasing age, body mass index, female sex, or higher number of symptoms during acute illness or a more severe disease. So it has been found that this long COVID or post-COVID sequelae, or PASC, has been more in those patients who have had bad COVID disease. So what is basically the etiology of lung disease which is happening after COVID? So there are multiple factors which are involved, predominantly being lung injury, ARDS, the effects of mechanical ventilation, and direct injury from the virus. So we know that even those patients who are been having to take mechanical ventilation for a long time have some amount of alveolar damage, diffuse alveolar damage, and a pseudohyaline membrane disease-like feature, which is aggravating, or which is aggravating the pulmonary symptoms post-COVID. Now, if there is a background of underlying interstitial lung disease, in that case, the fibrotic lung changes which happen post-COVID can be all the more severe. So these are basically the etiological factors which are contributing to the post-COVID sequelae, or the PASC. So coming to a few cases, this is a 59-year-old female who had COVID pneumonia. Now, this is an initial scan of the patient during the peak to resolving phase, where we see a lot of ground glass attenuation and consolidation involving the basal segments of both lung with associated interlobular septal thickening. Now, this patient had respiratory symptoms which was persistent after COVID also, so she was in a regular follow-up. And because of this regular follow-up, she has had repeated scans, and we see that in the subsequent 2 months and the 8-month scan, most of this ground glass has now started resolving, and it has been replaced by thin parenchymal bands or bands, which again have gone down on the 8-month scan. So this was post-COVID change which was resolving, but what I want to stress here is this should not be termed as post-COVID fibrosis. The purpose here is to state that we should know that this kind of change, in which there is no architectural distortion, no tractional bronchiectasis and reticular distortion of lung in that case, this COVID is likely to resolve. The same, another patient with evidence of peak phase COVID showing the characteristic CT halo sign that we were seeing, was followed up on a 2-month, on an 8-month, and then on a 9th-month scan. And what we see here is the changes have resolved, have been replaced partially by areas of ground glass, septal bands, which progressively have shown diminution or decrease. And there has been no post-COVID fibrosis in this patient. So this patient improved on the subsequent scans, and now his PFD is normal. Now, as I have mentioned earlier, interstitial lung disease is an important aggravating factor, which, if present in the background, can aggravate post-COVID symptoms. So this was a patient of hypersensitivity pneumonitis, and he has been imaged once in a while, and this was his initial scan, which was pre-COVID. Now, he developed COVID, and as you see, there are areas of clustered, very closely packed areas of ground glass attenuation and consolidation, predominantly consolidation, with septal thickening involving the lung bases. And when this patient was followed up, he showed a lot of reticulation, architectural distortion, as well as tractional bronchiectasis. So the healing in this case was not just a plain healing which can be followed up and which will decrease. There was significant fibrotic changes in the lung. This we will term as fibrosis because there is definitive evidence of architectural distortion and fibrocystic changes with tractional bronchiectasis on a follow-up. And on a PFT also, this patient continued to have a restrictive pattern of lung disease. This is another patient who had persistent shortness of breath and tightness of chest for months after COVID infection. So a scan was done, and the initial scan showed some areas of parenchymal fibrotic changes in the parahilar upper lobe with patchy ground glass attenuation. Now, the patient's symptoms were in disparity to the CT findings. So the consultant said that we should go ahead and do an expiratory scan. What I want to stress here is a lot of these patients will have obstructive airway disease, and the mosaic perfusion defects would get accentuated on an expiratory scan. So in case of COVID patients in whom the symptoms persist and the normal inspiratory scan looks grossly normal, we should take expiratory scans, which will show us that there is evidence of airway disease or small vessel disease in the patient. So if you see the expiratory scan of the patient, another important thing is the small subsegmental vessels are showing dilatation. So this patient had microvascular disease also, which happens in COVID. I will come to the details of that in my subsequent slides. So an expiratory scan, and in case we see basal lung opacities, a prone scan also becomes very important to mark differentiation between postural changes as well as persistent post-COVID basal fibrosis. This is a characteristic Atoll sign or reverse halo sign, which happens in organizing pneumonia. So a segment of COVID patients who are being followed up are not showing significant resolution of symptoms. So the changes are persisting for a pretty long time, and a lot of these patients are having a feature which is known as organizing pneumonia, persistent organizing pneumonia as we call it, or fibrinous organizing pneumonia in PASC as the pathologist calls it, which shows a characteristic Atoll appearance. There are areas of organizing pneumonia or ground glass with peripheral areas of consolidation or hyperdensity. So these patients who develop organizing pneumonia post-COVID will continue to have symptoms for a longer period of time and need to be followed up for a longer period of time. This is another presentation of organizing pneumonia, this was a scan which was done at approximately 6 months, and the patient was symptomatic for a long time. And the scan showed areas of thick interlobular septal thickening with organizing pneumonia in lower lobes, which subsequently on later scans of 9th and 12th month are showing resolution. So this was not fibrosis, this was organizing pneumonia, which is taking more time to heal. Now coming to the role of pulmonary embolism. So we all know that COVID virus has a strong affinity for the endothelium, and it is causing direct invasion of the endothelium. So it is causing a lot of hypercoagulable states also. So the prevalence of venous thromboembolism in hospitalized patients with acute COVID-19 has been reported to be as high as 25%. So basically, these patients who present with subsegmental and segmental pulmonary embolism can have a lot of features which would be masked on a normal CT. So briefly, I would like to discuss the role of dual energy CT, which is now coming up for evaluation of perfusion defects in COVID-19 patients. So dual imaging CT plays a very important role in evaluating patients after acute COVID-19 with persistent symptoms. And basically what we see is in dual energy CT, I will not go into the details of how it is done, but it is a form of CT which is now being used at a lot of centers to map perfusion defects. And there are very technical terms which are used to map these perfusion defects in patients, and they are visualized even in patients who are seen to have a normal HRCT but are symptomatic. So it adds to the information, because a lot of perfusion defects would not be picked up on a normal HRCT when a patient is put on a post-COVID follow-up. So dual energy CT suggests that a lot of vascular dysregulation is happening by COVID. So I would like to quote an article. This is a very good article which has been published in RSNA in 2020. It is a radiology journal, and this article is stressing on the role of dual energy CT as far as the pulmonary complications of COVID-19 are concerned. And basically, they have classified the DECT findings in COVID into 4 groups. These are mosaic perfusion, focal hyperemia, focal oligemia, and a hyperemic halo sign. So we'll just discuss briefly regarding what it is. So mosaic perfusion is something very similar to mosaic attenuation as we see on a normal CT. On a blood volume mapping, there are areas of alternating relatively high and lower perfusion in the lung parenchyma because of the perfusion defects which are happening in COVID. So that is called as mosaic perfusion. Focal hyperemia is an area of increased perfusion compared to the background lung. Focal oligemia is an area of relatively decreased perfusion compared to background lung. And hyperemic halo sign is an area of high perfusion surrounding an area of central low perfusion. These are the 4 primary patterns of DECT that has been described in COVID. Briefly, this is a patient with a bad COVID pneumonia, and I have placed the HRCT and the blood volume mapping simultaneously. So the HRCT was showing subsegmental dilated vessels with areas of parenchymal consolidation in the right upper and superior segment of lower lobes. And these are wedge-shaped areas of parenchymal consolidation and ground glass, which are COVID related, as well as few dilated vessels. Now, what the perfusion scan is showing us are areas of low perfusion at the site of disease with an area of hyperemia in the areas which are showing dilated vessels. So these perfusion alterations are adding to the symptoms. Similarly, in the same patient in the basal zone, where we see areas of parenchymal ground glass in the periphery, there are marked areas of perfusion defect on the blood volume mapping with surrounding zone of hyperemia or focal hyperemia, surrounding zones of hypoperfusion. So these kind of perfusion maps on dual energy CT help us map the perfusion abnormalities which are happening. So just briefly summing up what we see on a pulmonary angio. So not all patients with COVID will show embolus. So we have to basically identify enlarged subsegmental vessels and extension of these vessels along the pleura, along the fissure with mosaic perfusion pattern. And on a dual energy CT, as I previously mentioned, mosaic perfusion, regional hyperemia or oligemia, and hyperemic halo. These are what we will look for. So what is mosaic perfusion, and how is this mosaic perfusion in COVID different from mosaic perfusion of other diseases? So as we all know, just like mosaic attenuation, mosaic perfusion, it is basically, it is caused by 2 important features. One is small airway disease and the other is small vessel disease. So mosaic attenuation and perfusion in a lot of other respiratory infection is because of bronchial wall thickening, mucus plugging, visible secretion or emphysema. But in COVID, what we are seeing is on perfusion mapping, a lot of normal appearing lung parenchyma is also showing that this virus of vascular reperfusion defects that it is causing. So the perfusion defects which are happening in COVID on a dual scan are not in the typical, they have more of a regional distribution and peripheral distribution, stating that besides the small airway occlusion, there is a vascular component to it. The pattern is slightly different from other respiratory viruses. So this is an iodine mapping map of a patient who had an HRCT. So there are a few things I would like to show you. See, there are dilated vessels, subsegmental vessels, which on the iodine map are showing high flow, whereas the areas of lung which are showing consolidation and ground glass are showing low flow. Similarly, at the base of the lung, besides this area of patchy areas of subsegmental ground glass and consolidation with interstitial thickening, there are focal areas of oligemia if we visualize properly. Like this anterior segment is showing a focal area of oligemia, and this is very well evaluated on a perfusion map where the oligemia is visualized. So not only is there hyperemia, there are small vessel oligemia, vessel-induced oligemic areas also in the lung parenchyma in post-COVID patients. So what I would like to put in one line is, in those patients in whom you as a clinician are getting symptoms or respiratory distress or other tachypnic features or whatever, the patient is symptomatic, but the HRCT is showing not significant finding. In those patients, a dual scan or a dual CT can map out perfusion defects and explain the cause of the patient's respiratory distress. Still, there are areas of uncertainty as far as imaging is concerned, because we still don't know how much we don't know about the functional significance of the CT findings as far as the patient is concerned. Also, in the background of pre-existing interstitial lung disease, identifying post-COVID fibrosis is difficult. We also don't know about the long-term outcome of these patients who are presenting with fibrosis or perfusion defects, or what are the predictors of improvement. So pre-COVID scans, I mean the COVID scans, we have objectified with a CORAD score, with a severity screening, but still now regarding the fibrosis as well as the perfusion defects, no objective mapping of the lung has come up to tell us about the prognosis. So just briefly summing up, the classification of PASC PASC has been predominantly done into three groups: the ground glass, the mixed ground glass, and fibrotic or predominantly fibrotic. So we can classify post-COVID scans into three types: predominantly ground glass attenuation, mixed ground glass and fibrotic, and predominantly fibrotic. Besides, we have to all know that presence of just ground glass or parenchymal brands is not fibrosis, and these patients on a follow-up would show significant improvement. So this is what a characteristic pulmonary fibrosis would look like. There are areas of architectural distortion, reticulation with tractional bronchiectasis. So this patient would have persistent respiratory disease for a long time and is unlikely to show complete resolution. This was a patient of breast carcinoma, and she had an episode of COVID, and post-COVID she presented with respiratory distress and persistent tachypnea. What the post-COVID scan showed is a lot of dilated segmental vessels, stressing that vascular alterations are happening, and this is the predominant cause why the patient has now respiratory distress. So another thing that we need to stress is not all interstitial lung edema would be COVID. So this patient had pleural effusion, and this is a patient of pulmonary edema who has interstitial edema along with right-sided, predominantly right-sided, and mild left-sided pleural effusion. So when we look at a scan, not every scan is COVID. That needs to be kept in mind. Post-COVID patient with a well-circumscribed, thick-walled lesion with central pockets and kept in mind. And pulmonary mucormycosis is also being associated with a lot of oculorhinocerebral mucormycosis. We have all seen as radiologists, few cases have come to us also. So this has now gone down, but initially in the post-COVID complications, we were seeing these cases where mucosal thickening and soft tissue was being visualized in the paranasal sinuses with bony erosion. This was a patient of rhinocerebral, red rhino oculo mucormycosis, not cerebral, sorry. And he had a breach in the inferior wall of the right orbit with a soft tissue extending into the extraconal space and abutting the inferior rectus. So this is just summing up that what do we take in from this entire presentation? One, that post-COVID respiratory compromise is common, is happening. So when we do a CT, our primary aim is to differentiate fibrosis from resolving COVID. So objectifying fibrosis is very important. We have to objectify that this is fibrosis and this is resolving. When it is fibrosis, the chances of the patient showing persistent symptoms would be higher. Some changes will resolve on follow-up. Delayed resolution, patients still having symptoms, HRCT looking normal.
I think, what happened?
It is seemingly disconnected.
Okay. I think she was almost at the fag end of her lecture. So it was a nice lecture, and she has brought out very well the fact that the changes in the lung in COVID are vasculogenic, which is very important to understand for everybody. We now will go to our next speaker, that we have all been waiting for. Dr. Shumita Kundu is my senior from my same college. She's one of the best radiologists that our country has today, and she has many publications. I have listened to many lectures deliberated by her. She is a senior, very senior and respected radiologist in Calcutta, in this part of the country and in the country as a whole. I will now request Shumita Di, as I call her, to start with her deliberation. Thank you.
Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Please continue.
So I'll continue. First of all, let me thank both Bhattacharya brothers for their kind invitation and very kind introduction to speak on MRI in time of COVID-19. We have to follow certain guidelines which have been issued by the American College of Radiology, which says that with known active COVID-19 infection and persons under investigation for COVID-19, the ACR recommends that practitioners minimize the use of MR except when absolutely necessary and postpone all non-urgent or non-emergent exams, and where possible to use alternative techniques so that the patient's clinical management is not affected. MR in COVID positive active patients needs to be done only when absolutely necessary. FDA also has certain fixed guidelines for us where strict enforcement of sanitization procedure of the MRI unit and staff is mandatory. And it is also very important for us to remember that patients, caregivers, and staff should not use any metallic mask or PPE, which are sometimes there within the mask, particularly in the nasal bridge of the mask, or they have certain filters which contain metal, because there have been instances where MR has caused burns where there has been metallic component either in the PPE or in the mask. So these are some of the guidelines for which we have to be very, very careful in each and every patient. Now, as we know, COVID-19 is a multi-system involvement in disease, and it involves from the head to the toe of the patients. Of course, the chest remains the region which is most often imaged. Now, MRI does not have that much of an important role in the chest, but it plays an important role in evaluation of effects of the disease on other systems like the brain, including acute and chronic ischemic changes, acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, COVID-related disseminated leukoencephalopathy, rhinocerebral ocular mucormycosis. Studies have been going on to evaluate the olfactory bulbs as well as the gyri for olfactory and gustatory cortex evaluation, including fMRI studies, spinal changes for transverse myelitis, GB syndrome. These are all some of the conditions where MRI plays a very, very important role. In the thorax, changes in the lung parenchyma can be evaluated, but of course, as we have heard always, that HRCT would be the most important investigation. Even in pulmonary embolism, of course, CT has the more important role. MRI would be required in only those patients who are allergic to iodinated contrast or do not want to undertake any kind of radiation. As far as myocarditis is concerned, MRI with delayed contrast enhancement is the modality of choice. Also in musculoskeletal involvement like myositis, avascular necrosis, some of which examples I will be showing in some of our patients, MRI is the investigation of choice. As far as cerebral and peripheral vascular thrombotic complications are concerned, Doppler studies, contrast enhanced CT and MR angiography are all helpful and can be done as the availability of the instruments and the equipment is concerned. Now, long-term evaluation for neurological and psychiatric effects of COVID-19 will be a work in progress in subsequent years, and we have to wait for that. But for now, what we see is COVID-19 patients coming to us with acute infarctions. This is an example of a patient showing multiple infarctions, both in the anterior as well as the posterior circulation, involving the frontal lobe, both parietal lobes, as well as the cerebellum. These are the diffusion-weighted images showing restricted diffusion. These are the FLAIR images showing hyperintensity in the areas of involvement. This was a patient of ours who was 33 years male with post-COVID left hemiparesis and behavioral change. When we did the MRI on him, we found that there was a subacute to chronic infarction in the right frontoparietal region in the middle cerebral artery territory. This is the T2 image. This is the FLAIR image showing areas of encephalomalacia as well as more recent in ischemic change, and this is the diffusion image showing some areas of restricted diffusion. These are the T1 weighted images pre-contrast showing low signal intensity areas, and this is the post-contrast study which does not show adequate contrast enhancement. These are very fast angiogram images which we take in these patients who are not very cooperative. Here you can see that the left middle cerebral artery is showing adequate flow signal, whereas beyond the right MCA bifurcation, the M1 segment bifurcation, there is very poor signal in the peripheral arteries, because of which the patient is having right middle cerebral artery infarction. Now, COVID-19 associated encephalomyelitis, like Adam-like disease, we don't have a case of our own. So I have taken the help of the literature, where you can get these white matter focal hyperintense lesions. Here, both the cerebral hemispheres are involved. The brainstem is involved. These are the diffusion images showing restricted diffusion. These are the contrast studies which are not showing very much contrast enhancement in these lesions. Now, this was a patient who came to us with post-COVID 55-year-old male presenting with left facial and upper and lower limb tingling and numbness. He had recovered from COVID-19 and these were his subsequent complaints. What we found was that there were bilateral, extensive and fairly symmetric white matter hyperintensities in both cerebral hemispheres, external capsular regions, some amount of changes in the basal ganglia, as well as the thalami. The diffusion did not show any restricted diffusion. The MR angiography was essentially within normal limits. And there was some foci of hemorrhage in both thalamic regions. And we thought that this is likely to be COVID-related diffuse leukoencephalopathy. There have been studies where the olfactory bulbs and the olfactory gyri as well as the gustatory gyri have been evaluated with the help of MRI. This is a normal patient of ours showing the normal olfactory bulbs on this T2 weighted high resolution coronal images. This is an image which I have taken from the literature where this patient had anosmia during COVID-19, and we can appreciate that both the olfactory bulbs are showing a little bit of atrophy and also signal alteration. This particular study has shown that some of these patients with anosmia have had olfactory bulb thickening with edematous signals, or they have had altered signals with atrophy, depending on the stage of the disease. Now, COVID-19 is frequently associated with various bacterial and fungal co-infections, as we all know, particularly in immunocompromised diabetic patients and those who have received steroid therapy, out of which in the last devastating COVID-19 pandemic, which we had in India, rhinocerebral ocular mucormycosis was one of the very unfortunate instances. Patients very often require surgical treatment, which sometimes has unfortunate morbidity and mortality. So let me show some examples of ours. This was a 39-year-old female with post-COVID right-sided ptosis. The patient was, she underwent biopsy and mucormycosis of paranasal sinuses was diagnosed. This is the STIR coronal image. Here, the inflammatory changes in the frontal, ethmoid, and right maxillary sinuses are showing bright signal intensity, whereas the areas of where the mucor is present are showing low signal intensity, as we can also see here in the right inferior nasal turbinate, the right ethmoid sinus, and the walls of the maxillary antrum. This same patient also had extension of the changes to the right orbital apex, to the right infratemporal fossa, and also extending intracranially to the right cavernous sinus. If you compare the two cavernous sinuses, you can see the soft tissue mass of the mucor over here and lack of flow void in the cavernous part of the right internal carotid artery as compared to the normal left side. Those were T2 weighted images and STIR images. So what does the contrast study show? This is a pre-contrast T1 weighted image showing low signal intensity in the affected areas. After giving contrast, the inflamed mucosa shows enhancement, whereas the areas where the mucor is there is poor contrast enhancement, particularly in the nasal turbinates. And this has been given in the description of black or dark turbinate sign or black turbinate sign. But we can also see this in aspergillosis and other granulomatous conditions. So this is not really absolutely typical of mucormycosis, but we can of course see it in that. These are the areas of rim enhancement where we can see in the skull, in the infratemporal fossa, as well as in the cavernous sinus regions. And there is also a rim enhancing granuloma in the right side of the pons and cerebellopontine angle. The lesion is also extending into the right orbital apex, and the cavernous sinus and the orbital apex involvement are possibly causing the ptosis for this patient. Because she had compromised vaso-invasive complication of the right internal carotid artery, which is not showing enhancement in this post-contrast study as opposed to the normally enhancing left internal carotid artery, this patient also had infarction in the right MCA territory. This is a subacute infarction. There is some amount of enhancement in the post-contrast study. This was another patient who was a 45-year-old diabetic patient. He was recovering well from his COVID. And then one day when he was having his lunch, he said he felt that one of his incisor tooth becoming loose. He complained about it to his physician, and the physician, of course, thought that this is probably due to involvement of the maxilla by mucormycosis, and he was sent to us for MRI. Here you can see that there is erosion and narrow edema in the maxillary bone. His tooth here was loose. There was inflammatory changes in both maxillary antrum, more on the left side. And these are the post-enhancement images showing enhancement in the areas of inflammation. This was done in May 21. The patient was doing well. Then suddenly one day he felt that there was some swelling in the inferior aspect and the lateral aspect of his left side of the orbit, in the periorbital region. So he was sent once again in July for an MRI. Here you can see that the zygoma is having a lesion. There is associated soft tissue lesion and edema. The masseter is showing edematous changes, some amount of changes in the maxillary antrum. The maxillectomy has been done in this patient, so you can't see the maxilla very well. And these are the post-contrast studies. There appears to be some amount of extension of the lesion into the orbit. So when he takes this report back to the physician says that now you have to have an exentration of the left orbit. Patient is devastated. However, he was kept on conservative management. He came back to us in August 21, and there was improvement in the zygomatic lesion, in the soft tissue changes in the periorbital region, as well as the involvement of the orbit. So this patient showed an improvement with his conservative therapy and did not require any further surgical management. This was another patient, a 36-year-old male who had post-COVID ptosis as well as proptosis. What we could find was there was extensive orbital as well as periorbital soft tissue edema. We could not really show anything which looked like a mucor, and we left the diagnosis as left orbital and periorbital cellulitis. Unfortunately, we don't have the follow-up of this patient, so we don't know what exactly was the final diagnosis. We have had patients for post-COVID psychiatric problems. Now, this is a 77-year-old male. He had improved from his COVID-19 infection, but he developed disorientation, incoherence of speech, and depression. He was sent for an MRI. We found ischemic changes in the brain. There was also a subacute infarction in the right basal ganglia. But then at 77, it's not that we don't expect such ischemic changes. We cannot pinpoint that this is secondary to COVID, but he had these changes. This was another gentleman, 58-year-old male. He came with persistent headache after COVID and confusional state. His MRI was within normal limits, and there was also no evidence of thrombosis in his sagittal or the other venous sinuses in the brain. This is something which I have taken from the pediatric neurology. Spinal cord changes, a 3-year-old female presenting with progressive extremity weakness and decreased sensation after COVID, showing extensive thickening and edema in the spinal cord, extending to the medullary region, post-COVID transverse myelitis. This was a patient who had COVID and he had several chest lesions. But after COVID, he went back home and subsequently he developed hemoptysis. He did not want to undergo CT and he came to us for an MRI. What we found was there were some fibrotic changes and few nodular hyperintensities, which we thought could possibly, since he had changes in these regions in his COVID period HRCTs, this could be fibrotic changes, possibly with some bronchiectasis changes. But of course, this patient will need follow-up with HRCT, and MR is not definitely the modality which will give any information over and above CT. There have been studies in the literature which have tried to compare high-resolution MRI with HRCT, and these are some examples which are showing the changes in the MRI almost as well as in the HRCT. But then these MRI will not be available everywhere. The machine will not be vacant, and it does take a little bit of more time than HRCT. So of course, HRCT will remain the modality of choice. But When it is myocarditis, it is MRI, which is the investigation of choice. It shows not only the areas of edema in the myocardium, it also shows areas of delayed myocardial enhancement, particularly in the subepicardial regions. The enhancement and the myocardial inflammatory changes can be of various types. They can be patchy, they can be small punctate foci of enhancement, and these patients will have to need follow-up with MRI with delayed contrast enhancement studies. This was in musculoskeletal disorders, of course, MRI is the modality of choice. This was a 67-year-old doctor who came to us. He had a very severe COVID pneumonia requiring ventilation and hemodialysis. He was sent back home. After a few days, he developed weakness of both lower limbs, more on the left side, and he was sent to us for an MRI of the lumbosacral spine, which really did not show anything much except for age-related disc changes. So we thought, why not take a look at his pelvic muscles and see if there is any problem there. And of course, there was a lot of edema in the gluteal muscles, particularly in the left gluteus maximus, and this is post-COVID extensive myositis causing the patient's symptoms. Now I will be showing you two cases, two siblings from the same family. A 4-year-old female, she had COVID-19. She received steroids, but very low dose of steroids. And she comes back to us with a history of pain in both the hips. What we found was there were irregular areas of edematous signal. The femoral heads were showing fairly normal signal intensity, and the signal changes were primarily in the subcortical region, subcapital region, and in the neck of the femur. So we were a little confused whether we should call it avian or whether it can be due to stress fractures. So we sent the patient for a 3-phase isotope bone scan, which unequivocally showed us that there is bilateral avascular necrosis. A few days after that, her brother, 19-year-old brother, comes to us saying that while he was jogging, he developed a pain in the left hip. And he had also had COVID-19, and he was also kept on steroids, but not on very high dose of steroids. These images show bilateral extensive avascular necrosis on both sides associated with effusion in the hip joints. You don't need a bone scan or isotope 3-phase scan to show that these are avascular necrosis. It is very unfortunate that siblings from the same family who would have bilateral avascular necrosis following COVID-19. The literature tells us that in COVID-19 patients, avascular necrosis develops even with steroids which are of a lower dose as compared to non-COVID patients who are receiving steroids. So COVID-19, because of its coagulopathy disorders, leads to increased incidence of avascular necrosis in these patients. Post-vaccination complications, really, we have had so many patients who have come to us post-vaccination, but we have not really found any complications so far. So I had to take the help of the literature to show you some images. This is a patient who was having myeloma, and after his COVID vaccination, you can see FDG uptake in the site of injection and also in lymphadenopathy. Lymph node enlargement is a known complication of post-COVID infection. So what causes the confusion is when these lymph nodes appear in patients who are already having a carcinoma like bronchogenic carcinoma or breast carcinoma. So in these situations, what is done is we keep the patients under observation, sometimes for 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes for as long as 12 weeks, to see if there are any changes, whether the lymph nodes are regressing in size or increasing in size. Then if needed, if they are increasing in size or not regressing, then go ahead with a biopsy to find out whether they are due to post-COVID vaccination complications or due to the disease process itself, a malignant disease process itself. You can get acute infarctions following vaccination. You can get left facial nerve palsy, where we can see enhancement in the left facial nerve on the left side in this patient. And also post-COVID MR, post-messenger RNA COVID-19 vaccination has a known complication of myocarditis. There have been studies which are going on now. Post-vaccination, cerebral venous thrombosis. This lady, she has bilateral hemorrhagic infarcts and no flow at all in the venous sinuses after COVID-19 vaccination. Unfortunately, she did not survive. But fortunately, severe, debilitating or fatal post-vaccination complications are not of frequent occurrence. Hence, vaccination, face masking, sanitization, including hand wash and social distancing are still the best methods to limit spread of this devastating disease. In conclusion, I would like to say that MRI is a useful and sometimes the best diagnostic tool in evaluation of certain conditions, which are the effects and complications of COVID-19 vaccine infection. Sequelae of this dreaded disease may unfold in the days and years to come, and the role of various imaging modalities will have to be ascertained with experience gained collectively throughout the world to help humanity overcome the disastrous results of this infection. So, with prayers and hope for a COVID-free world, I would like to thank you for your kind attention to my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shumita De. Now I would declare it open for question and answers. So I have Priyanka, are you still there?
No, she is disconnected because of technological glitches.
Okay.
She's
From-
connected back.
Okay.
Yes.
No, she's connected now.
Yeah, I had one question which is slightly unrelated. Like, are you using dual energy CT regularly? And in that case, are you injecting contrast regularly while doing HSC?
In COVID cases, sir, especially or in general, sir?
Like pertaining to your upper respiratory tract diseases.
Okay. Sir, dual energy CTs, no. For a routine CT chest, we are not using it in the dual energy phase. Only for those cases who are presenting with hemopsis, especially for performing the angio studies, we are doing it all in the dual energy CTs. But while acquiring a normal CCT chest or a NCCT chest, we are not doing it in the dual energy phase.
Like as it appears that in COVID, contrast CT is better done in dual energy because of the vascular changes and the perfusion defects and the hyperperfusion that is seen in COVID.
Right, sir. If these, especially like what Dr. Amrita has also shown, those patients who are coming with the slightly post-COVID PASC's phase, we are performing them in the dual energy CTPA vascular imaging phase.
What is your
Imaging phase. Sir, in some of these cases, we have found the perfusion defects, which with this typical reperfusion type of a pattern, which also again the vascular dilatation which happens proximal to the sites of the involvement by the COVID pneumonias. Those areas are giving us this perfusion, hyperperfusion areas, and those regions which are involved with the COVID or secondary to the infarctions, those areas are giving this type of reduced perfusions. And also in those cases where only there is this subpleural type of subtle fibrosis reticular pattern is coming, in that also, when in few cases only we have performed this CTPA in dual energy, those regions are showing us the reduced perfusion, we can say. It's not exactly defects. I mean, it's not exactly the perfusion defects per se, but a reduced perfusion areas are seen in those regions which are involved. But how they evolve over time, that we are still yet to see.
Yeah. With the present knowledge, do you think that dual energy CT perfusion imaging scores over the routine expiratory film that we have?
For the perfusion defects, sir, dual energy provides us with this type of features which are useful. So the vascular imaging, the perfusion imaging features which are available with the dual energy CTPAs, those are definitely useful, but will they replace or not? It's difficult to take a call at this time point.
It is definitely a bit more objective, but as far as their usefulness to replace is really not yet, I think. It's not yet time for us to.
Depends. Not really. I'm not having that much of the data to say that it will be able to replace the routinely performed CTPA imagings. But at our institute, I would like to state that we are performing all the angiography studies in the dual energy scanners.
So Amrita is back, so she was a proponent
Right.
of dual energy CT. So Amrita, your views on that?
Am I audible, sir? I'm traveling, so my audio is going off and on. Hello?
Yeah.
So I think as far as our the role of dual energy CT, I think is as of now HRCT still predominates, but in case of complicated those cases in which the patient is clinically symptomatic and the HRCT per se is not explaining the degree or the intensity of clinical symptoms, for an answer, I think a dual energy CT might help out, because there could be areas of the still that I've read it's the dual energy CT is picking up areas of perfusion defect even in those areas which are appearing normal on an HRCT. So there is, I think, for the unanswered queries, dual energy would have a role. But considering its availability is limited, HRCT still predominates.
I don't see many questions coming
There
from
is a
the audience.
there is a question
Hello?
from the audience.
Yeah. Go on, go ahead.
There's a question from the audience. Can DCT replace CTPA?
DCT is really an extension of CTPA. So when we are doing CTPA, it's always better to do it, according to me, in a dual energy mode, because there are certain advantages intrinsic to the dual energy CT which can be added to the CTPA. Everything that is seen in CTPA can be seen in dual energy CT. We can extend our findings, informations in dual energy CT to some extent.
There are some. If
We have another
clinicians
question.
Please spell it out.
We have another question. If clinicians suspect airway abnormality, should we ask for DECT?
Airway obstruction.
Airway abnormalities.
Like it's a airway. Priyanka, are you there to answer this question?
Right, sir. I think related to the dual energy CT, if as sir mentioned, it is just the extension of a technique to acquire, or we can say better technique to acquire a CT image. It won't change how your HRCT reconstructions are going to look. Okay, for the airway abnormalities per se, again, I would just like to state that, especially in cases like bronchiectasis who present with hemopsis, or we are suspecting carcinoid tumors which are bleeding, then we go ahead and perform our angiography studies in dual energy CT just for a better visualization of the arterial supply to these structures or hypertrophic bronchial arteries. Per se, for a routine airway abnormality imaging, we do not perform the scans in a dual energy mode. That is, we do not require the imaging to be performed with two energy spectrums, and we a normal MDCT, a normal CT volumetric scan would suffice for the airway abnormalities.
One definite advantage of dual energy CT is that we can get a virtual non-contrast image from that. So we can sometimes reduce to one sequence. Like suppose we do a plain CT and then we have to decide that we have to give contrast. We can do without that, give a contrast CT and get a virtual non-contrast CT from that, get the informations. So like one needs to really understand the principles of dual energy CT to use the dual energy CT to its hilt.
Right.
I have a question for Shumita. for post-COVID myocarditis is definitely one field where MR has a tremendous role to play, because it can pick up the changes of myocarditis when all other modalities fail. So I would ask you to elaborate it a little bit more for the clinician friends to understand.
Okay, for one, the clinical presentation of the patient, that will have to be taken into consideration. The echocardiography findings, what MRI does show are areas of edema, particularly in fat suppressed or stir sequences within the myocardium. They can be scattered. They don't follow any particular vascular territory. The delayed contrast enhanced studies are extremely important because they will show the areas of enhancement where there is inflammation. The pathology is that it may be due to the virus affecting the myocardium itself, or due to the vascular changes which can occur. But the problem is that we have to differentiate it from myocardial infarction. Of course, myocardial infarction will follow a particular vascular territory. Many of these patients have comorbidities, like they might have had a myocardial infarction previously. So the enhancement pattern is also very important in delayed enhancement images to evaluate myocarditis, because it's usually subepicardial, or it may be scattered and punctate, not really following any particular vascular territory. So these are some of the pointers which tell us, along with the clinical correlation, that this is myocarditis.
Are there any other questions from the audience? I suppose it was a wonderful, experience to listen to all our esteemed speakers. All of them have taught and explained really well in a very simple manner about the various radiological changes that we get to see in COVID and post-COVID. So thank you very much. May I now hand over the mics to my elder brother, Parthasarathi Bhattacharya.
Thank you, Pinak. It's in fact a pleasure and privilege to get all the faculties today, and I am really grateful to all of them. I also express my gratitude to all my audience and request them to be available to listen to our PalmoCon programs on every Sunday evening. With this simple note, I again express my thanks to my faculty and to you. Thank you very much, and close the session.
Thank you.
Thank you.